My name is Greg Hamilton, or Gregory W. Hamilton, if you will. Yeah, I served for 23 years at the North Pacific Union Conference for the Northwest Religious Liberty Association in the Northwest in Vancouver, Washington area, and which covered 5 states: Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. We had a team of 32 attorneys and 5 lobbyists and 2 retired judges. And we initiated a number of bills in those state legislatures and defeated 28 really bad bills and passed and initiated and passed 13 bills. I actually wrote the Religious Freedom Act in Alaska, and also with Senator Ipsen in Idaho, passed the Religious Free Exercise Act of 2000, which Governor Dirk Kempthorne signed, and also the monumental Oregon Workplace Religious Freedom Act, which the ruling by the Supreme Court just 4 years ago in the Groff decision involving an Amish mail carrier who during COVID refused to deliver mail for Amazon through the U.S. Postal Service, through the contract that they had on Sundays. And it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court looked at a number of provisions, and I believe, and I may be wrong, but I believe the Oregon Workplace Religious Freedom Act helped restore the original intent of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which I'm not going to go into. But basically, it was a 9-0 decision, and liberals and conservatives joined together on it, which may sound alarming, but actually it was a good thing, because now most of our union conference public affairs and religious liberty director have very few workplace discrimination claims to deal with, which is good. But it also kind of makes their ministry somewhat irrelevant in some respects. But I've always said focus on the advocacy part, focus on education. And so that's what they're having to shift their priorities to. Um, I'm sitting here in the Hamilton Library and Constitution Center here in Western Colorado in Grand Junction. And this lecture, Christian Nationalism and Calvary's Prophetic Warning, is based upon a manuscript that I've been writing for a number of years, based upon 40 plus years of sermons, which have been solely focused on the closing scenes of the life of Christ and parallels to current events and Bible prophecy. Um, I, what I'm doing is I take a very interdisciplinary approach to understanding the Gospels instead of just warm, fuzzy promises. And it's a deep dive on the Pharisees, the religious leaders, Caesar, Pilate, Herod, the disciples, just all the different factions and groups. It's quite a deep dive, and Judas is focused on a lot, of course, and the competition between Christ and Judas for the hearts and minds of the disciples. John Stott, probably my favorite religious scholar, who used to be the rector for the All Souls Church in England. He wrote a book called The Cross of Christ, which many of you may be familiar with. But he gave a lecture at Baylor University where I did my graduate work in church state studies at the J.M. Dawson Institute of Church State Studies at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. And he said that Jesus focused more on on helping the disciples and everybody around him understand the true nature of his kingdom, even more than the true nature of salvation. Of course, he said you can't separate the two, but nevertheless, I thought that was an interesting statement because we tend to skip over the obvious that Jesus was constantly offending and countering the Israeli or Jewish nationalism of his day, and to try to help people to understand the true nature of his kingdom, that he was not coming as a king to drive out Rome and conquer the world and so on and so forth, and establish his kingdom on the earth for 1,000 years, like so many Protestants believe today. And so it's I deal with postmillennialism, premillennialism, and how essentially they come to the same conclusion that this earth must be conquered for Christ. and basically all of the religions and ethnic minorities and all peoples must submit to this world order. I'm not into one world order conspiracy theories, so just know I'm very much into exploding Illuminati and trilateral commission myths and everything else under the sun, including Jesuit nonsense. That's I don't traffic in that. I believe in true scholarship and I believe in um, peer-reviewed articles and books, and I believe in an academic approach, and I'm not very patient. Although I do believe that out here in Western Colorado, I deal with sometimes people are very well-meaning, and but you have to just love them and accept them where they're at and meet them where they're at and take a hit and laugh at yourself. And pretty soon they become to trust you. And then after a while, it's like they start asking questions and they start to think it was Christ's method. Christ didn't force himself upon anybody. And I don't think we should force ourselves on anybody. I don't think we should be overly combative. Just speak the, truth to power and let the chips fall where they may. Educate, educate, educate is what I believe. It's what Ellen White believed in. And I thoroughly believe in that approach. It doesn't pay to be combative. Try to be as winsome and diplomatic as possible. And finally, I've given this lecture, especially the Christian nation debate part, actually at the Alexandria University in Yesh, Romania. In fact, 28 different cities in Romania, also in South Africa, the Philippines, and Dominican Republic. So it's been very well received, the whole issue of Christian nationalism. So they pay more attention to our problems than than Americans do themselves. They're more awake to the problems in the United States than we are, if you will. So let's get started. Christian nationalism. What is it? How do we define it? Um, Christian nationalism is a political ideology that seeks to merge Christian identity with national civic life. Adherents believe their country was founded on strictly Christian principles and advocate for laws and public policies that reflect their conservative religious values. Next. Their core beliefs, scholars and sociologists who study the movement identify several key components of this worldview. Number one, cultural primacy, the belief that Christianity should hold a privileged, dominant, and controlling place in public life, government, and educational systems. National destiny, the conviction that the nation is uniquely blessed or chosen by God, and that its continued success depends on adhering to biblical principles. Third, historical revisionism, which is what I mostly concentrate on. The assertion that foundational documents were explicitly designed to create a Christian nation by law, a theocracy, if you will, or a theocratic government, which is slightly different. Why it is controversial? Why is it? The ideology is a subject of intense debate, particularly here in the United States. Critics, including the vast majority of practicing Christians, argue that Christian nationalism threatens our democratic republic, liberal democracy, and the constitutional separation of church and state, which the framers fully intended. They point out that it can exclude or marginalize citizens of other faiths or no faith, distort religious teachings by tying them to partisan political power, and conflate national identity with whiteness and spiritual salvation. A revival of Southern evangelical and Confederate manifesto thinking tied to the lost cause that dates back to the bitter aftermath of the Civil War. Kevin Burton, who's a professor at Andrews University, wrote a wonderful article, a deep dive, which I thought he wrote it so well for a popular audience that I just have to read from some of it. It's a recent article he wrote in the Lake Union Herald, and it's titled Dictates of Our Conscience. He published it or Lake Union Herald published it on June 23, 2026. And I was quite impressed. I'm impressed with his scholarship. He's the author of a new book called Apocalyptic Abolitionism, How Millennialists Helps Abolish Slavery and Reform America. And Lauren, he would be great to have on your program, I think. Here's what he wrote. Today, racism and religious intolerance are most clearly expressed through the lens of white Christian nationalism. This political project promotes, either implicitly or explicitly, an ideology of white Christian supremacy in national politics. It is premised upon the notion that America was founded as a Christian nation and that Judeo Christian values should be enforced through American law. This philosophy has a long history in the United States, but now seems to be at the height of its power, with strong support in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of American government. Significantly, white Christian nationalists reinterpret religious freedom as a privilege. The religious studies scholar Kayati Ye Joshi has demonstrated that America has always privileged white Christians by infusing the government and society with Christian beliefs, norms, and practices under the guise of pluralism. However, white Christian nationalists today are unsatisfied with this implicit power and seek to subvert religious diversity by redefining religious liberty in terms of explicit dominance. As a result, religious liberty is divested of notions of equality or equity on the premise that tolerance does not require that religious minorities and the non-religious be treated equally with white evangelicals. After analyzing data from all 50 states between 1998 and 2018, public policy professors Naile Saya and Studi Manchanda found that Christian nationalism is positively associated with anti-minority violence. Interesting. Political power and rhetoric directly contribute to these violent acts, as evidenced by Sayas and Manchada's finding that states where senators articulated support for Christian nationalism recorded between 1.4 and 1.5 times the number of Christian nationalist attacks. This data is supported by numerous other studies and affirmed by historians such as Matthew Taylor, which some of you may know, his book, The Violent Take It by Force, in an insightful study of how white Christian nationalism is threatening American democracy right now. And he writes, this is not a new phenomenon. White evangelicals have supported violence and oppression throughout their history in America, as evidenced by their treatment of racial and religious minorities. And I might add, not that it matters, but to me it's significant. Kevin Burton is white. And this is not an African American writing this. So kudos to Kevin for Dr. Burton. Um, so there's two other little things before I go to the next slide. If we could keep it back at the other slide. Thanks, Lauren. Um, there's this little, what do you call it? Meme, if you will, on Facebook. I'll just kind of show it right here. Um, it's called Christian Nationalism versus Christianity, two very different visions of faith and public life. It's a comparison contrast. Christian nationalism says America is a Christian nation, the government must protect it. Christianity, mainstream Christianity, says no, our country is rooted in pluralism and religious freedom. Christian nationalism says it claims America is especially favored by God. Mainstream Christianity comes back and it says no, it affirms affirms God's love extends to all nations. Loyalty to country can overshadow loyalty to Christ, which is what Christian nationalism is. And mainstream Christianity says, no, Christianity follows Jesus, whose kingdom is not of this world. Christian nationalism says it seeks to define national identity through one form of Christianity, and which becomes discriminatory and oppressive of all others in the end. Mainstream Christianity says, no, we learn from the church's past and we seek repentance. Christian nationalism pursues political power for a narrow group. Mainstream Christianity sees every person as made in God's image. Amen. Christian nationalism uses government to enforce religious beliefs. Yeah, that's what they want to do. That was most evident, by the way, in the Heritage Foundation's recent document calling for a restoration of Sunday blue laws, which I wrote an article in late January for Message Magazine for Carmela Monk, detailing that and the problems with it. And so far, they have not been able to fulfill their goals. It was in keeping with the 250th anniversary of celebrating our nation's independence. And they wanted to try to get these things enacted at the state level before then or by July 4th, and that has not occurred. They have failed, thank goodness. Um, Mainstream Christianity believes in building bridges with those serving the marginalized. Christian nationalism reinforces social hierarchies that privilege some over others. Mainstream Christianity stands with the poor, the overlooked, and the oppressed. Amen. And then one final thing I want to bring up before we go on the next slide, as it's an article, it was in Huffington Post, which, you know, some people may laugh because it's at Huffington Post, but this sociologist, Caroline Bologna, put together a 23-page detailed deep dive into the title is Vertical Morality Might Describe Why a Certain Segment of Society of Christians Seems So Unchristian. This framework reveals why some of this other group in our country, 30% of Christians, act in ways that contradict Jesus' teaching, Christian nationalists, essentially. Vertical morality is this idea that's a top-down authoritarian view of God communicating with man. God says, therefore, you must do. Um, and the horizontal morality is in reference to the Good Samaritan, acting out of just the natural goodwill of man towards man. Man is basically good. It really stems from the free will arguments for and against by Martin Luther and Didymus Erasmus. Martin Luther basically saying, no, it has the only way God man can do anything good is because God inspires him to do so. Man is basically evil, is what he concluded. Erasmus says, no, free will, man is basically good, which, tends towards socialism and communism and all that. And why the debates between Jefferson and Hamilton, which it spilled over to years later. Jefferson basically said man is basically good. Hamilton said man is basically evil. And that's basically how we get our two approaches to interpreting the Constitution, believe it or not. I wrote a paper on it at Portland State University years ago in 1985 for a professor, and ended up being 30 pages long. The professor said, I read it, but I graded you based on the weight of the paper. It's too heavy, too much to read. I gave you an A. So we had a good laugh over that. But anyway, he says, he was happy to receive it because I still look at that paper and I go, wow, thank you, God. It wasn't me, man. I tell you, it was a lot of research, and God bless me in writing that paper. But this vertical morality versus horizontal morality is very much with us today. And I thought it's a good paper. You should look it up. Write down the name, Caroline Bologna, just like the university in Italy, in the town, the city. Huffington Post, vertical morality. Just type in those words and you should be able to get it. All right, next slide. I'm moving on with my phone too, so I know where we're at. Um, so I have this very unique understanding of one of the things that I think is a problem in our church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have evangelists come to our churches, and we basically baptize a lot of people who look through their conspiracy theory lens, if you will, and they bring that into our church. And which, whatever. I believe in discipling people, so don't misunderstand me. This is what Jesus did. So I understand it's nothing's perfect. Nobody's perfect. No system is perfect. I'm not knocking our evangelists per se, but I believe that we've gotten locked into this false piety and the doctrine of prophetic inevitability. What do I mean by that? Well, since everything's inevitable, I can justify, hastening the Lord's coming by jumping on the bandwagon with this Christian nationalism. I'm hastening the coming of the Lord. And I ran into this all the time in our churches when I preach and different venues. And it was the same mindset. Well, why do we need religious liberty? Why do we need equality? Why do we need civil rights? And it was mostly by white males and some white females. And I never got this from ethnic minorities. By the way, you should know, a lot of people don't know this, not that it matters to you, but a lot of people think that our church is predominantly Republican. Not that that's a bad thing. I mean, I was Republican my whole life until recently, but you know, it's I'm a Lincoln Republican, let's put it that way. I believe in civil rights very strongly. Um, so I was a defender of civil rights, obviously. But the Adventist Church, according to Pew's study on religion and public life, this was several years ago, 59% are Democrats, which is the huge surge of ethnic minorities from other countries into our country, and they make up the bulk of registered Democrats, which is interesting. I thought that was fascinating. It had changed over the years. It was significantly more Republican from the time of Nixon on, even up to through Reagan and then Clinton and George H.W. Bush. But then it changed. It shifted dramatically with Bill Clinton for some reason. And I think it has a lot to do with the influx of migrant immigrant status of those coming from other countries, a lot from South America and Central America, and also Europe and Eastern Europe and Asia. So I think we should just keep that in mind. That's a little bit of a rabbit trail, but just keep that in mind. Um, so um, the person I wrote an article for the Gleaner once, the North Pacific Union Conference Gleaner, called "Persecuted." And I pointed out that basically there was this mindset among evangelicals on the right that they were being persecuted by secularists, especially with the issue of abortion and same-sex marriage and same-sex rights and how they were marginalized. They were therefore being oppressed and persecuted by secularists, which I found fascinating. I helped promote a bill that the North American Division put forward. Melissa Reed was the instigator of it, and through a Utah legislator who had crafted a bill that actually had become law in Utah called Fairness for All. And it was a very reasonable bill. I even promoted it in Idaho and elsewhere in our other states. And it was summarily slapped down, basically because there was only one federal sponsor. And you need about 100 different sponsors to get any traction for any bill. But nevertheless, there was this this persecution complex. And I've done a lot of studies and regarding self-fulfilling prophecies, and we're watching right now in our country where the so-called oppressed are becoming the oppressors. And it's fascinating because we're told that this would happen. And I'll share that with you as we continue to go on. So there seems to be this role reversal whereby Christians are led to oppress, persecute, and destroy their enemies, religious minorities they disagree with, religious and ethnic minorities, Jews and Sabbatarians, and especially legal and green card immigrants that threaten their majoritarian voting power, political dissenters, secular humanists, and same-sex folks, all the same people found in Adolf Hitler's concentration camps, which is ironic. There's this book I want to turn you on to. If you haven't read it, it's by Robert P. Erickson. He's the leading scholar on the Lutheran Church's involvement with the Holocaust and the rise of Hitler. It's called Complicity in the Holocaust, Churches and Universities in Nazi Germany. Robert P. Erickson, I sponsored him at Walla Walla Adventist University to lecture. I was very well attended. I had him also to my government relations workshop in 2018, where we had to pay big bucks to have him come for just two presentations, but very much worth it. It really kind of set the whole North Pacific Union Conference and all of our attorneys and lobbyists abuzz. And in fact, we published an entire 12-page article in the Gleaner about that, a review of the entire conference, but a lot of it had to do with Robert Erickson. And I tell you, it upset quite a few people. It was quite controversial, but I'm glad that the Gleaner and Steve Astown had published it at the time. It really, I think, woke some people up. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Lauren. All right, this is from The Desire of Ages, and you can think what you want, but I find it very helpful. Even E.G. White was very in tune back in the early 1900s regarding late 1800s, early 1900s, what was actually happening in the United States, and she also saw some of this in Australia. Today, in the religious world, she wrote, there are multitudes who, as they believe, are working for the establishment of the kingdom of Christ as an earthly and political dominion. They desire to make our Lord the ruler of the kingdoms of this world, the ruler in its courts and military camps, its legislative halls, its executive palaces, and marketplaces or businesses. Sounds like Christian nationalism to me. They expect him to rule through legal enactments enforced by human authority. And since Christ is not now here in person, they themselves will undertake to act in his stead, to execute the laws of his kingdom. Boy, they like, oh man, aren't we just all powerful? There's something else. The establishment of such a kingdom is what Israel desired in the days of Christ. They would have received Jesus had he been willing to establish a political dominion, to enforce what they regarded as the laws of God, and to make them the expositors of his will and the agents of his authority. But he said, my kingdom is not of this world. He would not accept the earthly throne. Their lust for power knew no bounds. Even the disciples, if you study it out very carefully in Desire of Ages, and I've read Desire of Ages 11 times now, and I'm telling you, Judas had almost convinced the disciples that Jesus was a lunatic. And why are we still following him? And I do this dramatic sermon called "The Clash of Kingdoms: Love, Power, and Betrayal in the Upper Room," and the whole dynamics between the struggle between Christ and Judas for the hearts and minds of the disciples. And you know, it was this "What have you done for me lately?" type mindset. They were conflicted. They believed in Jesus. They loved Jesus. But if he wasn't going to restore the kingdom, if they weren't going to have the top positions in his kingdom, we might as well knock him off or at least distance ourselves from him, which they did in the upper room as he hung on Calvary. But, you know, when you think of Calvary's prophetic warning, for today, it's very stark. It's very real. Are we on the right side of prophetic history is what I keep asking people. Are you on the right side of prophetic history? The Church of Christ is not one that's all powerful. It's one that's oppressed and persecuted and follows the life of Christ. Are we willing to be losers in this life, but winners in the next? No, there are many that would rather be on the winning side. And that's why they would like to be, in line with the Christian nationalists and the Christian right today. The Desire of Ages, which I've quoted, there's another text. By the way, that pop-up keeps coming up and blocking my view of the slides. There's another reference from Thoughts from the Mount of Blessings, page 126, where it is written that whenever the church seeks the strong arm of the state, she has lost, get this, lost the grace of Christ. Wow. To me, that is absolutely all powerful because to me, it's all about grace and everything's about grace. And yes, anyway, that's another deep dive theologically. But yeah, we're too legalistic. We're too fundamentalist. We don't hear enough about grace. I loved Morris Venden for that reason. We need more Morris Vendens back in this world. Trust me. All right, next slide. So history repeats itself. Charles Krauthammer, who used to be on Fox Sunday panel on Sunday mornings, who was a conservative, arch conservative, but he was a very reasonable conservative in many respects. He was a paraplegic doctor who got hit in a car accident, and anyway, he was a deep thinker, and he said, after 9/11, he said the United States is basically the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, the ancient Roman Republic, the Rome of the Caesars, and the Holy Roman Empire all rolled into one. And his emphasis, if you read some of his articles, was on the Holy Roman Empire, and he actually warned about the dangers of Christian nationalism overtaking his party, the Republican Party. And another person who used to sit on that panel at the same time was Liz Cheney, who, after the attack on the Capitol, the treasonous attack on the Capitol on January 6th, led by you know who in the White House, um, she, of course, chaired the panel, co-chaired the panel that tried to hold the attackers accountable and the one in the White House. And on those Sunday morning programs, she chimed in with Charles Krauthammer saying, yeah, you're right. It is a big danger. Well, we now see what's happened and why, Charles Krauthammer has now passed away and Liz Cheney lost her election in Wyoming. Well, listen to this. This is from Great Controversy, page 443. In order to control the consciences of the people, the early church sought the support of the secular power. The result was the papacy, a church that controlled the power of the state and employed it to further her own ends, especially for the punishment of heresy. Listen to this next paragraph because it's mind-blowing. We don't concentrate on this very paragraph very much, but here's what it says. In order for the United States, our beloved country, to form an image of the prophetic beast, that is the historical papal power of Revelation 13 that manipulated, dominated, and controlled the will of kings and emperors for how many years? 1260 prophetic years, day for year principle. So, in order for the United States to form an image of the beast, the religious powers must so control the civil government that the authority of the state will also be employed by the church to accomplish her own ends. Notice it doesn't say secular humanism, atheism, same thing, socialism, communism, or same-sex movements. No, it says religious powers, which in context in the following pages, 444 to 450, is a union of like-minded, power-hungry, conservative evangelical Protestants and evangelical Catholics. Mark Knoll, the famous church historian, who's still teaching at Notre Dame University, but used to teach at um, the Wheaton College, the Calvinist College, before he went to Notre Dame. He's a Protestant, but teaches at Notre Dame, and actually was the supervisor of Nick Miller's book on the origins of the religious freedom through the Protestant Reformation. Fantastic book published by Oxford University Press. I highly recommend it, although he and I differ on some things. And so did the professor, his supervisor. And sorry, Nick, I probably shouldn't have said anything about that. But nevertheless, um, the, oh, I forgot where I was going on this. Uh, anyway, notice the context. It's not. The big bugaboo, the big propaganda thing is, oh, you're a communist, you're a socialist. Well, that's nonsense. I mean, communism is basically dead. Even in China, it's basically a fascist government with capitalism. It's only communist in name almost. At least, it's authoritarian communist, but it's really a fascist fusion of communism. It's almost communism is basically non-existent there in many respects. It's not much different than today's Russia or other countries. And so communism is basically dead, a relic of the past. So for people to keep bringing that up and using that as a bugaboo, it's crazy. So I want to note one other thing. There's this book by R.W. Southern, which we studied at Baylor University, where I did my dissertation on Sandra Day O'Connor's judicial philosophy on the role of religion in public life. And it's still an original work, but he wrote this book called Western Society and the Church in the Middle Ages, How the Papacy Became the State, was his focus. And he talks about Charlemagne on Christmas Day, AD 800, he was crowned. And he was so mad at the Pope Leo II that, and his father had been crowned before that, King Pippin, by the same Pope. But he was mad. He said, what right? How do you think you have power over me by crowning me? So what did he do? He was dumb as a rock, by the way, Charlemagne. He really was. He had to have Alcuin, who was the British Archbishop, Cardinal from um, oh, from England, from London, come and be his tutor because he was illiterate. Well, so Alcuin basically ran the show. I mean, he basically had almost total control over Charlemagne, who basically is the inspirer of today's European Union, by the way. But in his statute of him riding a horse outside Notre Dame Cathedral is very famous if you haven't seen it before. Take a good picture of it when you're there. There's a lot of history behind that. Anyway, behind him anyway. But he got so mad, he said, you know what? I'm going to employ the church to do my bidding. So he made them mayors and he made them head of armies and he made them Catholic priests and bishops and basically the Catholic Church over time became the state. In other words, it basically not only became the state, but it pretty much called the shots. So that's how basically, yeah, you could say it started with Constantine, and that's true. But, you know, it was Charlemagne who really put the Catholic Church in a position of power. It wasn't really even 538 AD, which we, put the whole 1260-year prophecy at. It was a gradual process, which of course, we like to simplify things, and in our understanding of 1260 years, we have to have a date and an ending date and all that kind of stuff. I understand that, but it was a long process. So anyway, we must remember that even Jesus himself warned his disciples, all this I've told you so that you will not fall away or be deceived. Who are the ones that will put you out of the synagogue? Who are the ones that are coming to say that anyone, say if we kill you, we're offering God's service? Jesus says they will do such things because they have not known the Father or me. Next slide.
Give me a moment. Give me a moment.
Okay. Sorry.
There we
So
go.
we're going to go into America's Christian nation debate. Did the constitutional founders intend the United States to be a Christian nation by law, a theocracy, or a theocratic government? Did they intend to prevent only the establishment of a national church? How far did they intend to reject medieval European standards of church and state? Does history mean anything to us anymore? The answer to these questions are critical toward understanding the church's true prophetic mission in the United States of America, especially in light of the latest, I can't read the rest of my sentence here, so many people commenting, of the latest recommendations from the Religious Liberty Commission headed up by Dr. Ben Carson, who their main argument is that the founders only tended to prevent the establishment of a national church. Next slide. Um, the main point is this. You remember this one thing. It's very important. The lessons of history demonstrate, and this was from James Madison in his Memorial and Remonstrance, number 8. The lessons of history demonstrate that for the state to financially aid the church is to empower the church to advise, influence, direct, and eventually control the state. Just remember that. You got to remember that. I'll repeat it. The lessons of history demonstrate that for the state to financially aid the church is to empower the church to advise, influence, direct, and control the state. Even liberals in the United States, even liberal scholars. I have several books by several legal scholars um, who believe that financial funding is fine. As long as they don't put up symbols and this and that, Ten Commandments, everything else, we're fine. It doesn't violate the Establishment Clause. Man, they don't know their history. Finances is everything, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Next. The Seventh-day Adventist perspective is very simple, and it comes from one statement by E.G. White in Great Controversy 443. The founders of the nation, she wrote, the founders of the nation, the constitutional founders, wisely sought to guard against the employment of secular power on the part of the church. With what? Its inevitable result, intolerance and persecution. The church's mission has always been to keep church and state separate so that religious freedom and thus its gospel mission can thrive to bless others. It does not, as mere bystanders, apathetically accept the prophetic inevitability of intolerance and persecution. Instead, it believes.
I'm sorry, Greg. I had not realized this thing about the chats popping up at the bottom of the
That's all right.
screen.
I'm going to go to my phone here because I've got
I
all the slides right here. I
I don't
need.
know quite how to turn it off, or I would.
Don't worry about it. let me continue. Instead, the church believes in vigorously championing the equal constitutional guarantee of civil and religious freedom for all individuals, not just Adventists. My successor at the North Pacific Union Conference published an article in the Adventist Review called Adventist Churches Urges Religious Liberty Commission to Preserve Church-State Separation. So the NAD has taken a stand and saying, we don't like your view of saying that the separation of church state is a myth that the founder fathers never intended. So I'm glad they've at least taken a stand on that. And I'm being nice by saying that. Let's move on. Next. The Declaration of Principles in Liberty Magazine, which is published in every issue and has been ever since Roland Hegstad wrote this piece, along with Mitch Tyner and some others, which I'm very grateful for. I thought they nailed it. The God-given right of religious liberty is best exercised when church and state are separate. I should add Papa Dr. B.B. Beach, who was like a father to me. Government is God's agency to protect individual rights and to conduct civil affairs. In exercising these responsibilities, officials are entitled to respect and cooperation. Religious liberty entails freedom of conscience to worship or not to worship, to profess, practice, and promulgate religious beliefs or to change them. In exercising these rights, however, one must respect the equivalent rights of all others. Amen. Attempts to unite church and state are opposed to the interests of each, subversive of human rights, and potentially persecuting in character. To oppose union lawfully and honorably is not only the citizen's duty, but the essence of the golden rule to treat others as one wishes to be treated. Next. The government of the United States, listen to this, of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Did you get that? Yeah, our founding fathers crafted that. The first Senate, in cooperation with the Senate president, who was John Adams at the time, and George Washington was the president. George Washington served 2 terms, and then John Adams became president in 1797, and he signed it into it's a formal treaty into law. So the Constitution reflects our founders' views of a secular government protecting the freedom of any belief or unbelief. The historian Robert Middleclough observed the idea that the Constitution expressed a moral view seems absurd. There were no genuine evangelicals in the convention, and there were no heated declarations of Christian piety. There's a book by Isaac Cramness called The Godless Constitution. I know it's a very sacrilegious title, but he proves, I mean, in detail, that the founders never intended our nation to be a Christian nation by law. But I'm going to go ahead and ask the question, but are we a Christian nation? You know, it's a legitimate debate. Might as well bring it up, right? So, what about it? Well, demographically, the Gallup poll in 1994, and Gary Wills pointed out in this in his book. He's a famous professor, University of Northern Illinois in DeKalb, where my best friend was head of the philosophy department for 45 years, David Buller. And anyway, he wrote in there and he cited the Gallup poll. 94% at that time in 1985 believed in that they professed to be Christian. 96% believed in angels, believe it or not, and 90% believed in an afterlife. So that was interesting. Then Newsweek, John Meacham, the former editor of Newsweek, came along, did a similar survey in 1995. And he published in his editorial that their poll showed that it had decreased by nearly 20% to 75% in 1995. So 10 years later, it had fallen down. Baylor University, my alma mater, in what year was that? 2015, I think it was. Anyway, not very long ago. Their big, I mean, it was a giant, the most giant survey. It was better than Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. They said that professed Christians had fallen from not only that 94% to 75% had fallen to 60%. So that was in 2015. So we could we could reasonably argue and say that demographically, even though we're a pluralistic nation of many religions, or no religion, or hostile to religion, whatever a person's persuasion is, demographically, we're still barely predominantly Christian. Historically, yes, going back to the so-called Puritan founding, which is what Christian nationalists love to do. They love to blur or confound and make the founding fathers to be just like the Puritan divines. No, forgive me, they ran like blank from the Puritan founding. They 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 very much adopted. There was this fusion. Nick Miller writes in his book that I mentioned earlier that it was basically a theological basis that brought about religious liberty in America. I differ in slightly. It's an academic argument. I say that from my study, especially at Baylor University with my professors and Mark Knoll from Notre Dame, who was his supervisor, there was a fusion. It was simultaneous, even providential, if you will, of Enlightenment thinking and theological thinking regarding religious freedom. You had the Baptist fellas like Isaac Backus, John Leland, Roger Williams, sure. You had the theological, but you also had the Enlightenment, English, French, Scottish Enlightenments that very much fused together to bring about our Constitution. So, are we a Christian nation by Constitution? Is our Constitution are we meant to be a Christian nation by law? No. Why? Let's move on. James Madison, who I will focus on heavily along with Thomas Jefferson. There's a book out by Stephen Green, professor at Willamette University. He's the chairman of the law school there, just across the street from the Oregon Capitol in Salem. He's a very close friend, a good friend, and he's written a number of books on the American founding. And he wrote a book recently called The Collaboration of the Founding Fathers, Jefferson and Madison, that it's just very revealing. If you don't have that, it was just published last year. I encourage you to get it and read it. Anyway, James Madison, in his proposal of the Bill of Rights to the House of Representatives, the first U.S. congressional session of June 8, 1789, he wrote, I confess that in a government modified like this of the United States, the greater danger lies rather in the abuse of the community than in the legislative body. The prescription in favor of liberty ought therefore to be leveled against that quarter where the greatest danger lies, namely that which possesses the highest prerogative of power. But this is not found in either the executive or legislative departments of government, but in the body of the people operating by the majority against the minority. In other words, the Bill of Rights is absolutely necessary to prevent a majoritarian lynch mob of minorities that they disagreed with. And Jefferson kept writing feverishly letters to James Madison because Alexander Hamilton was very much opposed to the Bill of Rights. Yes, my relative. I'm ashamed to say that, but he was very much. He said, "Well, they're enumerated. They're just they're there in the Constitution. It's a given." And James Madison was agreeing with him at the time, and Jefferson persuaded him finally, writing from Paris, to demand that at least 9 of the 13 colonies that were becoming states to demand a Bill of Rights before they would agree to signing to ratify the new Constitution. So Jefferson really won the day. He was really the true champion of religious freedom, along with James Madison. Next. So James Madison, in his Memorial and Remonstrance, which is actually written just before he died in 1832, in number 8, he says, if religion be not within the cognizance of civil government, how can its legal establishment be necessary to civil government? What influence, in fact, have ecclesiastical establishments had on civil society? In some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of the civil authority. In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. Oh boy, we see that happening now. In no instance have they been seen the guardians of the liberties of the people. Amen. To whatever degree, Robert Alley wrote from the University of Virginia in another book called Without a Prayer, He writes, to whatever degree a form of religious establishment, no matter how mild, enters the Constitution through the amending process, free exercise of religion is dust. Next. Revisiting Jefferson's Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, Part 1. This is very important to understand. Now we're making even more of a deep dive, so please follow. Mr. Jefferson, then retired at Monticello, noted in his autobiography that even though a majority of the legislature were churchmen, a great majority rejected an amendment put forward by those who insisted on declaring in the preamble that coercion was a departure from the plan of Jesus Christ, the holy author of our religion. While Jefferson had no personal problem with the theological correctness of such a statement, he had a problem with Virginia declaring that it was a Christian state, when in fact it was more than a state that merely tolerated other religions, but instead gave them equal status with Christians of every creed and stripe. He observed that the insertion was rejected by a great majority, in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and Mahometan, the Hindu and infidel of every denomination. In other words, all people of faith, including those who chose to refrain from faith altogether, were to be treated equally. And this was basically borrowing from Roger Williams' philosophy, the founder of the colony of Rhode Island, the Baptist divine, if you will, preacher and theologian who had studied under Edward Coke in England, who was his mentor, the great legal scholar. Why did he say an infidel of every denomination? Well, he was basically saying that there, including himself, who had been accused of being an atheist by many, including John Adams in the presidential election of 1800, and Hamilton and others who were trying to demean him, calling him an atheist. In fact, Dr. Benjamin Rush wrote a letter to him in 1808. It was after Jefferson had just retired from the presidency, went back home to Monticello, and he said, so I hear some of you are calling you an atheist. What are you? And Jefferson wrote back and he said, no, he says, I'm a universalist Unitarian. I'm neither a deist or an atheist. And I believe in that Jesus was good. I don't believe that he was divine, that he was divinity or the divine Son of God. I don't believe in the Trinity, and I don't believe in his miracles. So, of course, you've heard about the Jefferson Bible. And he put together his own Bible in Hebrew, Greek, French, and Latin. So, very famous piece of work where he excludes all those things from his version of the Bible. What's interesting about Jefferson, I hear people say, oh, Jefferson won't be saved. That guy studied his Bible nearly every night for about an hour before he went to bed. The guy, I don't know what anybody thinks, but he's sure he kept his slaves, but his slaves loved him. Yeah, he was, I'm not going to judge people, that anyway, I'll go on. Next slide. This is the Oregon Workplace Religious Freedom Act signed by Governor Ted Kulongoski on April Fool's Day, 2010. And I'm very proud of it. There's me standing next to him with my legal secretary, Rhonda Bolton, and the Senate President, Brad Avakian, and then Dave Hunt, the Speaker of the House, standing behind the governor's chair. And we had every religion conceivable in Oregon represented there. Of course, Sikhs and Muslims, Hindus were prominent there. But so were Mormons, Adventists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians, Catholics, everybody under the sun. And the guy smiling in the back, he was the Secret Service protection for the governor. And the Speaker of the House, Dave Hunt, said, when we awarded the governor and Brad Avakian and Dave Hunt at a big event in Woodland, Washington, on top of a mountain at this French palace, beautiful open skies on a summer evening. He laughed. He said, yeah, he's not supposed to be smiling. That's a no-no. Anyway, next. Part 2 of Revisiting Virginia's Statute of Religious Freedom. Derek Davis, my mentor and retired chairman of the J.M. Dawson Institute of Church-State Studies at Baylor University, a Baptist university, comments that Jefferson wrote this at a time when America was even more culturally Christian than it is today, But he argues this never meant that Virginia, let alone America, was to be Christian in a constitutional sense. The founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia could have easily included language in the Constitution declaring the nation to be Christian had they wanted to. In fact, many citizens argued that this kind of expressly Christian language at the state ratifying conventions after the document was presented to the states for approval. But the founders weathered these proposals, choosing to remain true to their conviction that the nation would embrace a principle of religious pluralism whereby all citizens' beliefs would be legally protected and none favored. James Madison, these are his arguments, and they're interesting. Perhaps the most convincing proof that America's constitutional founders did not intend to establish a Christian commonwealth, comes from the pens of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Shortly before his death, James Madison addressed the threat of a commonwealth in a September 1832 letter to the Reverend Jasper Adams, which was in response to a sermon pamphlet that Adams had circulated to key individuals, including Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story. Madison objected to the central argument in Adams' sermon. The idea that since the Christian religion was a cultural and moral force that pervaded the entire nation, it deserved to be financially supported by the government through general taxation. This, Adams argued, would solve many of the nation's moral ills. Next. For Madison, Adams' argument was more than just a suggestion to subsidize Christian churches, but an attempt to favor Christianity in a discriminatory and thus unconstitutional manner. This ran contrary to his original understanding, particularly when the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment was largely drafted in the First Congress of 1789 on the fresh experiences of defeating Patrick Henry's funding bill, a bill originating in 1776 that would have established a provision for teachers of the Christian religion. It was defeated by a coalition of minority Protestant religions with Thomas Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia, which in 1786 became Virginia's Statute of Religious Freedom and allowed for no such funding of favoritism, particularly of the Anglican Church. In response to Adams, Madison wrote, "The simple question to be decided is whether a support of the best and purest religion, the Christian religion itself, ought not, so far at least as pecuniary means are involved, to be provided for by the government, rather than be left to the voluntary provisions of those who profess it." Madison's rhetorical question had a quick and decisive answer. On this question, experience will be an admitted umpire. In the papal system, government and religion are in a manner consolidated, and that is found to be the worst of governments. Whoa, that's a powerful statement. He knew his history. Madison argued that this was because history had proven that such a system had neither been favorable to religion or to government. Benjamin Franklin, he had an observation. Next. When a religion is good, I conceive that it will support itself. And when it cannot support itself, and God does not take care to support, so that its professors are obliged to call for the help of the civil power, it is a sign, I apprehend, of its being a bad one. Benjamin Franklin was always so logical. Love that guy. He was really, to me, he was like the godfather of the Constitutional Convention, along with George Washington. I tell you, those two were amazing. We've already cited this, Memorial and Remonstrance number 8. But number 3 is very important. I'm going to skip past that. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? Interesting. Okay. That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of any one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever. Now, the debate over defining religious freedom, as I mentioned earlier, was between Patrick Henry's establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion for Virginia. And it was a debate that occurred for 10 years, 1776, from the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And again, this is in Virginia at the House of Burgesses, their legislature in Williamsburg. And that debate lasted until 1786, way after The American Revolution had been won in 1781. And in 1787, of course, we had the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Okay, so here's how Madison won the argument. Next. Thank you. Look, Christian, he wrote, how comfortable are you that Henry would have the government provide tax support to ministers in order to achieve purely temporal or political goals? Madison's appeal, however, was more than one directional, because he argued in Memorial and Remonstrance that the lessons of history demonstrate that for the state to financially aid the church was to empower the church to advise, influence, direct, and control the state. In other words, we now have a place at the table. You now can advise the government and eventually direct and control it. That was the problem. And Henry did not see that. Madison understood that. Next. Now, you've heard of faith-based initiatives. I know this is kind of an old lecture, but this is based on an article I wrote for Liberty Magazine in 2018, and it was very well circulated. That particular issue was extremely well circulated. I was proud of it. Anyway, President Trump at the time, with faith-based leaders surrounding him, basically the same people that promote Christian nationalism today, May 1st, executive order restores a Bush-era initiative. Bush was really into faith-based initiatives, but then he shelved it. That's one thing. Reagan, Bush Senior, they used the religious right, and then they pretty much shelved them, which it was an interesting phenomenon. And it goes back to the original warning and threats, even by William F. Buckley in his fireside chats, warning in some of his works and writings that he was very concerned that the evangelical right was going to take over the Republican Party. Well, this was sort of the first foray of that. It restores a Bush-era initiative that allows religious groups to be more involved in providing federally funded social services. But more importantly, in the name of religious liberty, it repealed Obama administration rules that limited the ability of religious groups to use federal funds to proselytize or preach to those they served. This potentially crossed a constitutional line that violates the Establishment Clause provision separating church and state. The Trump order obliterates the rule that faith-based groups were required to abide by in referring beneficiaries to alternative programs if they objected to religious teachings while receiving services. Now, the original under Obama and the others, including Bush, W, who basically gave us the FBOs. But we have to remember the familiar axiom with federal and state regulation: he owns the gold, makes the rules. True. But as I'm going to show you, you have to look at that in reverse. That's a nice statement. It's a very familiar one, but in the end, it falls apart. Follow me. Faith-based organizations are eligible to participate in federally administered social service programs to the same degree, this was back in Obama's day, as any other group, although certain restrictions on FBOs, faith-based initiatives that accept government funding, have been created by the White House to avoid violations of the Establishment Clause. They may not use direct government funds to support inherently religious activities such as prayer, worship, religious instruction, or proselytization. Any inherently religious activities that the organizations may offer must be offered separately in time or location from services that receive federal assistance. FBOs cannot discriminate on the basis of religion when providing services. Okay, so I attended a seminar. Next slide. This was at the Red Lion Inn and Hotel at the Quay in Vancouver, Washington. And this was in, I forget what year this was. I don't remember exactly. Anyway, it was when, I think it was, 2006, it says. Thank you to myself there. John J. DiIulio Jr. Came, and there was about 2,000 or 3,000. I don't remember how many filled that place up. It was a big, big, big place where we had this big presentation by DiIulio. When I went to the microphone, I happened to be sitting at a round table, and the microphone was just sitting right there. It's just like begged me to come up. I was actually the first one to get up and speak in response to his presentation. I asked about how such social service assistance would be regulated based upon the above listed restrictions, which I already read to you. He said before a crowd of 2,000 plus charitable organization leaders from all over the Northwest, that that was a problem and that the ability of the federal government to regulate the use of such funds was a difficult task. Mr. DiIulio later became a critic of the program and left the Bush White House office in protest. And so we have to look at James Madison reasoning revisited. That the lessons of history demonstrate that for the state to financially aid the church was to empower the church to advise, influence, and direct and eventually control the state. Exactly what the definition of the prophetic image to the beast is about that we read in Great Controversy 443. Imagine the political hue and cry of religious charitable organizations and the wider political community if such regulatory power was carried out in a serious manner. It would prove to be a no-win situation. This is what Madison warned against. It empowers religious organizations to direct and possibly over time control the state. Next. Today, there are powerful forces, and I write this in my book. If you don't have it, you can still get it on Amazon. It's called Soul Liberty, Celebrating America's First Freedom. I think you would enjoy it. It was published in 2017. I wrote basically my manifesto, and here it is. Today, there are powerful forces that threaten both the establishment and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment. Government neutrality means religion and religious institutions must be allowed to thrive freely, but without its official endorsement through direct financial support, government-sponsored school prayers, or by overt means of symbolic messaging via Ten Commandments or nativity displays. The First Amendment, in part, states Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And I don't mention this here, but I do break it down in other lectures. The key word in that statement in the First Amendment is the word "an." "An" is the root word for any establishment of religion. Just remember that. Okay. Today, many conservative evangelicals and Catholics seek to reinterpret the No Establishment Clause provision separating church and state in ways that would require government to financially support their institutions and enforce their dogmas with the intent of solving the moral ills of the nation. Next. Part two, and this is part of an old lecture I've given, so bear with me. This is old news, but nevertheless, it's still alive and well in terms of this movement. Led by constitutional and historical revisionist David Barton, there's a movement afoot called Project Blitz, which you don't hear about that anymore, but it's the same program, the same influence that Christian nationalists are trying to achieve through this so-called Religious Liberty Commission put forward by the White House in recent months. It seeks to overwhelm and influence state legislatures to introduce and pass bills that will eventually overthrow the constitutional separation of church and state and certain aspects of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which they see as the central impediments to be removed in their fight against the restriction of direct government funding of religious institutions, 2, free speech restrictions on faith-based organizations that receive funding for charitable social work, and 3, equal constitutional protections for women, ethnic minorities, and same-sex people. In other words, basically eliminating civil rights as we know it today. Establishing the United States as a Christian nation by law is their main goal, to restore what they perceive to be the good old days. This is what the Heritage Foundations and the Federalist Society's sole goals are. Okay, next. Admittedly, there's a tug of war going on. This is because in recent years, and I might offend some of you, but that's fine. I'm willing to do that. I'm an equal opportunity offender, by the way. This is because in recent years, the secular left has regularly sought to marginalize the free exercise of religion by failing to recognize that government must have a sufficient compelling interest when lawfully denying or restricting the constitutional right of individuals and institutions of faith to exercise and maintain their religious mission and practices. This has been manifested by attempts to defeat state religious freedom restoration acts that ensure the right of institutions to hire only those who meet their mission standards and purposes, and ensure that business owners and employees are not forced to violate their conscience and their rights to free speech. The recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the master cake situation highlights this war over whose equally guaranteed rights will prevail. And as I said many times, you know, that case in Denver, I'll just be honest with you. I'm still a member of the Supreme Court Historical Society. For 20 some years, I was a regular member 6 times a year. I went to Supreme Court lectures at the Supreme Court. by various scholars. I met in the anterooms with big, huge paintings of all the chief justices of the founding fathers. I would meet with all the Supreme Court justices would show up, and we got to mingle with them with everybody else was drinking wine and so forth. I drank my seltzer water and ate my cookies. But I uh, I happened to be standing there at this one event after the masterpiece cake decision came down, and Clarence Thomas walks in with his wife, Justice Clarence Thomas, Associate Justice. And he shakes my hand and says, "Who are you?" And I tell him who I am, President of the Northwest Religious Liberty Association. And he says, "Well, you're doing good work." Of course, he didn't know what an ardent separationist I was and how much I opposed his uh, opinions. But nevertheless, he started rambling, and a whole crowd started gathering around, including some media people that it could only have pad and pen. And he started railing against his own decision. Here he was the majority ruling, but the rest of the court didn't go along with his. See, he keeps trying to overthrow the doctrine of neutrality in the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which would totally obliterate separation of church and state. And so what happened was in that ruling is the masterpiece Cate decision. The Supreme Court says, okay, yes, he had an actual specific religious mission, and it was stated. He had a mission statement. And his mission was to put religious messages on all the cakes he bakes, which means his clientele was only, well, actually, he did it for all religions, which was very nice of him. But he excluded gay couples, same-sex couples. And so this is what he got in trouble for. So, but the Supreme Court says, okay, he has a religious mission. He's already stated that. And so we give him an exemption. But the problem with that is it didn't allow exemptions for any other cake maker or photographer or flower or florist who didn't have a mission statement. Yes, it warns them, it notifies them, hey, you got to have a mission statement, you know. But still, I'm not sure where the Supreme Court will go on that. But I guess I'm too radical, and I know some of my own church members probably don't like to hear this, but that's fine. I believe that Jesus, like Dick Cheney, like a true heart of a father, when Liz Cheney was knocking her older sister for being gay, Dick Cheney came along and defended his older daughter and said, I love them both equally. I have the heart of a father. And here's this arch, uh, um, former vice president under George W. Bush, who some used to call Darth Vader, whatever. I mean, he actually turned out to be pretty good in some respects in terms of opposing the current administration with his daughter and wife. His wife, Lynn, wrote a wonderful book on James Madison, by the way, the history of James Madison, and very much is an ardent church-state separationist. So was interesting to me too. But I would not only, if I was a baker, I would bake the cake. I would tell them that, hey, I don't necessarily agree with your lifestyle, but I'm going to honor your choice. This is what Dick Cheney does with his daughter. He honors her choice. Imagine Christ. I'm just thinking of Christ. Did he just, get out his Bible and thump them over the head and say, well, I reject you. You're evil. No, of course, we can take Paul's writings, which are often taken out of context. But, no, Jesus met people where they were at. And of course, same sex, you'd be stoned to death back in Christ's day. But, I'm sure there were secret people that did that. And Jesus didn't refuse anybody. He accepted tax collectors. He was accused of being a wine bibber. He was accused of being Beelzebub himself, the devil. I mean, so whatever. I don't mind. I mean, I would attend the wedding and rejoice in their celebration. My wife at work at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Portland, um, there were two people who I won't name. One was a school teacher and one was a fellow engineer with Laura. And the rest of the office was having a hard time with Laura's idea of throwing a bridal shower for both of them at our house. And but guess what? Almost the entire staff and her colleagues showed up at our house, and we all celebrated their desire to be married. Do we agree with it? No, they know. Laura explained to them why she disagreed with them, but honored their choice. okay, and said biblically we just can't see it. But that's how we need to treat people. I think it's a reasonable approach. So you can debate that if you want. I'm sure you will. Anyway, so anyway, in my book, I write both forces are harmful to our constitutional health, and yet the nation's founders anticipated this severe tension. That is why they created an internal check and balance within the very wording of the First Amendment to prevent the country from being overrun by either extreme in the great church state debate, a puritanical versus godless society. Remove this balancing safeguard, and our nation's constitutional guarantees will be lost, and with it, our civil and religious freedoms. I quote Sandra Day O'Connor because um, to me, she was a paragon of virtue. I really admired her. Did my dissertation on her judicial philosophy and the role of religion in public life. She summed it up best at the University of Ireland, Northern Ireland. In a lecture, she said, the religious zealot and the theocrat frighten us in part because we understand only too well their basic impulse. No less frightening is a totalitarian atheist who aspires to a society in which the exercise of religion has no place. Friends, that's really the balance. I could go into more. Next slide, if you guys want to feast on those book titles. It should be there, Lauren. Yeah, just leave it there. People can write down book titles if they want. Um, and we'll just leave it there. And then I'm done. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. And I was a little nervous and a little rusty, and but I appreciate your patience. Thank you.
Well,
Thank
and
you so much. Go ahead.
yeah, I'm sorry, Gene. I shouldn't have interrupted. I wanted to apologize to Greg and to the rest of you. It is only recently that I realized that some of you have something turned on in your Zoom that makes every chat message pop up on the front of your screen. This has never happened to me, so I was unaware of that. And let me be clear that this week I'm going to call Zoom and figure out how to fix that because that should not be happening. You should have your chat messages in a different box to the side of your screen. So, Greg, I apologize to you and
Oh,
to
no
all the
problem.
rest of you who struggled with that. But I'll
I
go
was
ahead and
I was fully prepared.
okay. I'll back out now and let Nick have his anyway.
Nick, have you unmuted?
I am.
Perfect. Can you tell us what you're thinking about today's presentation? And first off, I've encouraged people from our international audience to participate. So I'm going to ask each person before they speak to just say where they're from. If you could, even if it's from the US, if you can just let us know, because that kind of gives us a point of view.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that, Gina. And thank you, Greg, for your presentation. Greg, you really took me back. I happen to have been the first selected officer from a metropolitan area in faith-based initiatives, and I worked very closely with the Bush White House back in 2001, moving forward, and have some real memories about that. But I wanted to ask you a question about the First Amendment and the exclusion clause because it's come up again in recent discussions. The amendment that we commonly call the separation for church and state does not actually say separation of church and state, and even more so, one person made mention of the fact that it says Congress shall make no laws concerning the prohibition or the establishment. And they were saying that because of that, a state could be allowed to exclude or establish. And as we're moving closer in some people's minds to the resurrection of states' rights, they're saying that even though Congress may not exclude or establish, that states can exclude and establish. How do you feel about that as far as the language in the Constitution is concerned, and as far as this movement is concerned, where states might exclude and establish, but not the nation itself through Congress?
That's not hard to answer, really. You keep forgetting about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment has the Commerce Clause and other clauses in it that make it's a post-Civil War amendment that finally brought the first 8 amendments into line. In other words, it says Congress, the original First Amendment, but when you read Congress, based upon the 14th Amendment, when you read Congress, it basically means all levels of government, even down to the township. In other words, the 14th Amendment provides federal government oversight over states. In other words, federal provisions trump state provisions. So states have to fall in line with the federal, provision of Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. You have to understand that people like, Judge, what's his name? The failed judge that was heard before Congress. Oh, I forget his name now. Maybe somebody could help me. But he argued this. Justice Scalia argued this, but they all wanted to do away with the incorporation clause, which is what I call it. The incorporation clause. You're talking about Amendment number 11, which has to do with states being sovereign. But again, the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, it overrides that. So that's why they want to do away with the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, if you read the very first, I'm gonna go over. I'm gonna take my laptop with me. I'm gonna read to you what the first section of the 14th Amendment says. I have it over here on the wall below Nathan Green's painting of A New Birth of Freedom, which is a painting about Lincoln greeting the slaves right at the end of the Civil War. He sent that to me on my birthday just 2 years ago. But the 14th Amendment says the following: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. What the 14th Amendment did is incorporated the first 8 amendments into state law. In other words, states had to then adjust their laws to harmonize with federal law. So that's been the post-Civil War thing. They want to do away with the 14th Amendment, which in a big sweep, would not only do away with the constitutional separation of church and state, it would do away with women's rights, civil rights, it would get rid of equal protection, all of that. So that you may not understand fully and deeply, and I don't have time to go take a deep dive into that, but I wrote a paper on it at University of Nevada, Reno, when working on my master's in history. Jerome Edwards, the chairman of the history department, asked me to write it, and it's the anti-slavery origins of the 14th Amendment. And I go into detail. It's about a 42-page paper about the incorporation clause, what the founders of the 68th Congress intended, the radical Republican Congress at the time that gave us the 13th, 14th, and later 15th Amendments, which, without that, you would not even yourself have proper civil rights under the law. So that's the problem with that. So.
Okay, I mean, your presumption about my understanding notwithstanding, I appreciate the answer, and you're preaching to the choir. I agree with it. I was just wondering how you might respond.
Oh, okay, fine, great.
We can talk later about Jefferson and the love that his slaves had for him.
Oh yeah, you're right. There's a problem there. I agree. I was just oversimplifying. Yeah.
Okay.
I visited there many times, and I'm a Jeffersonian scholar, as well as a Hamiltonian scholar. And yeah, no, I understand where you're coming from.
I appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
I'm going to go next to Eduardo, and I'm just going to point out that he's the only raised hand at this point, which means I'm going to be doing some serious tap dancing here unless you guys raise your hands. So going to Eduardo. Tell us where you're from, Eduardo, and go ahead. Eduardo, can you unmute, please?
There we
Thank
go.
you.
Here we go.
Thank you.
Eduardo.
You remember A.T. Jones?
Yes, very much.
He said that the enemies of religious liberty are going to come with the flag of religious liberty.
Yep.
I was trying to find the quote, but I don't know where I put it. And I noticed that the Catholic bishops, American Catholic bishops, are waving the flag of religious liberty, which I think they don't have a clue what religious liberty is. And are you familiar with the Trinity Lutheran Church versus Missouri Department, the case of the Supreme Court of 2017?
Yes, I vaguely do. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Let me read you from what is her name?
It involved a teacher who was fired.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I try to remember the Associate Justice, a lady. She said, let me try to read it. If this separation means anything, it means that the government cannot, or at least need not, tax its citizen and turn the money over the houses of worship. The court today blinds itself to the outcome this history requires and lead us instead to place what separation of church and state is a constitutional slogan, not a constitutional commitment.
Wait a minute, there's two Trinity cases. There's one involving school playground and blacktop and equipment.
Yes.
Which one is it? Is it the school teacher firing or the school playground?
The playground.
Okay.
And Sonia Sotomayor said that the separation of church and state is no longer a commitment. It's only a slogan.
Yeah, I agree with her. She's upset about it. Yeah, no, there's definitely been a whittling away of it hasn't the constitutional separation of church and state, at least in concept, has not fallen. The application of it in terms of whittling it down has been severe. And I wish that the court would go back to Justice O'Connor's endorsement test and also Justice Kennedy's coercion test. And I could go a deep dive into that as well, but I'm not going to. But thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I totally agree with Sotomayor.
Thank you, Eduardo.
I've met her.
Thank you.
And talked to her. And by the way, I met her and talked to her, but she's a fellow diabetic like myself, and she's very frail. You need to pray for her.
Oh, yeah.
Her health is not the best.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eduardo. Lauren, I'm going to go to you, but before you speak, somebody has asked if we can, a couple people actually, take down the bibliography. It's distracting if you have the ability to do that.
I do indeed.
Great.
Sorry about that. I had forgotten that it was up because I was on a different screen.
That's okay.
Greg, that's the complication. Just to give you a heads up, that's the complication with running your slides at the same time. There's just a bunch of things you're not quite sure what's displaying at any given moment. But I promise all of you, I'm going to work this week to either figure out how to tell you how to turn off the chat previews or how to turn them off for all of you from our running of the screen. This is a new thing. This has not been going on forever.
Sure.
But that's the problem with programs. Yeah, they're always changing something. I have the same problem with my car. All of a sudden they do a software upgrade and it does something that it's never done before. It drives me
Right.
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just want to remind you that next week, Lindsay Painter is going to be talking about the purity culture and how that's worked its way into not just culture, but even government and what the problems have been. But you know, Greg, I was a pastor for 40 some years, and and when I was younger, you remember this too. You and I were probably roughly the same generation. It was so clear that church and state were separated. It was
Yep.
so clear that you didn't even want a politician to mention his religion.
Mm-hmm.
And to his credit, John Kennedy stood up and loudly proclaimed, I am not going to listen to anybody when it comes to religion. And I don't know if you remember this, but people were terrified when Kennedy became president. Like, oh my
I
goodness,
know.
what's going to
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I know.
do you remember even when Jimmy Carter mentioned that he was a Baptist
I
and
know.
that it was important? There are people who say, "Oh
Um,
no, he's a Baptist." I mean, like that was terrifying somehow.
well, yeah. Can I say something to that?
Oh,
Can I
absolutely.
respond to that? It's interesting. I grew up in Bakersfield, California, and my dad's best friend, they would often take a truck ride, and I'd ride in the back of the truck. I loved the wind in my face with their dog, and so my dad and Leonard would ride up front, and they had their window open, and I always listened to their discussions as we went hunting for dinosaur tooths and bones and stuff out there in Bakersfield. And it was really funny because there's lots of that stuff out there, by the way, still to this day. But we go out there on Sabbaths, and they'd say, "Oh, yeah, Jimmy Carter's the next president. He's. I wonder if he's going to bring us Sunday laws." Everything. It seems like every time a Democrat president got elected, if you're a Republican, Democrats are going to bring a Sunday law.
Mhm.
I always thought that was interesting because, a lot of people don't realize, and I didn't include this part in my lecture. I was going to, but I decided, no, my lecture's too long as it is. So there's this one little caveat, this nuance that I think people need to understand. The the Confederate South, the Dixiecrat South, the bigoted South, if you will, forgive me for saying that, and the Confederate South was about 70% Democrat for years until Nixon came along. Why? Because in the election of 1960, Kennedy was a Northeasterner from Massachusetts, liberal Democrat. And of course, when he gave that speech about separation of church state in Houston, which blew everybody away, saying, "No, I'm not going to follow the orders of the Pope. I'm not going to listen to the Pope." Um, the entire South, that was the beginning of the Republican Party's dance with the evangelical right in the South.
Mm.
Nixon won nearly all the South, and Kennedy barely won. Barely, it was the closest election in history, contrary to the Gore-Bush scenario in 2000. It was actually just as close, if not closer. Nixon lost. Kennedy won with the state of Hawaii, which was solidly Democrat. But those three electoral votes in the early mornings of 1960 um, put Kennedy over the top. That's how Kennedy became president, and that began Nixon's obsession against the Kennedys, if not before. But nevertheless, that began the dance of the Republican Party with the religious right. So by the time you get to Reagan and he says to Falwell, "I know you can't endorse me, but I can endorse you." And then it goes on and on. There's been a total transformation of the Republican Party into the Southern Confederate. In fact, the Southern states now are nearly 70% Republican, red states. Okay, there's been a total transformation in parties. The Democrat Party has become, maybe some to the extreme, to some would argue, the party of civil rights. Lincoln, they're Lincoln Democrats, if you will. Some of them call them Lincoln Republicans, but there's been this major paradigm shift among the parties, and a lot of people don't recognize that. final thing I wanted to say, the Religious Liberty Commission that Ben Carson co-headed up recently, there was one provision that is really wrong. It's not just that they said that the separation of church state is a myth. They basically followed through with abolishing the Johnson Amendment. Now, what is the Johnson Amendment? Lyndon Johnson put forth an amendment that basically said that if you invite a political speaker to your church, a political candidate, you have to invite the other one equally. Okay. And if one formally turns it down with a letter, okay, and the other one says yes, back when it was strictly enforced, neither candidate could come. But then they loosened up the restrictions as it went. The regulations kind of loosened up to where if one declined, you could still have the one, at least you invited both. Okay, so that you would appear nonpartisan. So therefore, the IRS wouldn't nail you for a violation of the Johnson Amendment and thus take away your tax exempt status. So that's a Johnson Amendment. Well, now they've done away with that in their Religious Liberty Commission, their new proposal, which says, phooey with all that. They can not only be invited, but now candidates can ask for monies from churches, direct funding of churches to political candidates, which was a no-no under the Johnson Amendment. That's how far we come. That's why I focused big time on the financial aspect of understanding the separation of church state, because nobody does. They focus on, Ten Commandments displays and all this kind of stuff, which bores me to tears, by the way. But I understand the debate about that. But I focus more on the financial because to me, if you give churches and religious powers direct government funding, okay, it allows those churches, those religious powers to advise, to eventually influence, direct, and control the government. That's kind of what's happening. It's right underneath our noses and nobody's paying attention to it.
No, it's terrifying. I agree with you. So I'm thinking back to, I don't know, about 25 years ago. Do you remember when Columbia Union College,
Yes.
they went to bat to get federal money,
Yes.
and they were very much arguing that this did not interfere in any way with what Columbia Union College wanted to do. It's now Washington Adventist University, and I'm not
Right.
sure it's much better off now than it was
No,
back
I've
then.
heard that they're about get ready to close in 5 years.
Yeah, I've heard that too. So how does that line up with what you're talking about? Should our colleges take money? Should our students take loans to study for ministry, let's say?
No. Now, in fact, there was already a decision in Washington State. Even Justice Scalia got schooled by Chief Justice Rehnquist in the Governor Locke versus Davey ruling. I forget which year that was. I think it was 2008 or something like that, where Justice Rehnquist, who had basically said in the Jaffrey case of 1985 that, separation of church state is a myth. He had come around because him and Sandra Day O'Connor were classmates and at Stanford Law School in California, and actually dated each other. And so they sat on the Supreme Court together, of course. But she had so schooled Rehnquist that he had come around 180 degrees. And even in a couple footnotes, schools Justice Scalia saying, no, this is a clear violation of the separation of church state. Look at the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom and the whole history behind that with Jefferson and Madison. And he schooled Scalia on that. So, no, it's clearly unconstitutional. I think Columbia Adventist University really opened up the whole funding path for faith-based initiatives and everything else, along with all kinds of other funding basically, I wrote an opinion that got in a law review. It was the Mitchell versus Helms decision, and it was Jefferson Parish down in Louisiana, and involved TVs and other equipment in private religious schools. And Justice O'Connor wrote the doctrinal opinion while Justice Thomas wrote the ruling opinion, but Justice O'Connor basically shot down Thomas and got the majority of the court to rule against his doctrinal reasoning to try to destroy neutrality, which is, getting away, just totally abolishing separation of church state, the Establishment Clause, the No Establishment Clause, but at the same time concurred with Thomas saying, well, incidental funding, indirect funding of these types of things is fine. That's where we're at. And that's why when Eduardo brought up the whole Trinity case about, playground stuff, yeah, it's considered incidental funding. But again, we're we're crossing that line to where you know, we're just starting to break down that wall more and more to where we have no wall. And that's kind of where it's going right now. And to me, whether you guys are into prophecy or not, I consider that prophetic. Anyway.
Greg, just keep it, just something to mention here. We've got 4 hands up. The rest of you don't raise your hands. I'm keeping an eye on the time. If we go past 3:30, can you stay on?
Yeah, me. Oh, yeah. By the way, I'm able to, I just noticed those comments, the chats that come up, I can
Yeah.
actually punch those out with the X on it. So I never noticed that before because I was so concentrated on my talk that I can actually punch those out. So it's not a problem, really.
Well, we need to teach that to everybody because I have never seen them. And
Yeah.
I must have them turned off, but I want to make sure all of you know that I apologize that we haven't solved this problem yet. Anyway, go ahead. The rest of you carry on. I'm sorry, Gina.
Thanks. That's okay. I'm going to go to my husband, Dan, who's down the hall from me. And I know he's raised his hand to help me out here. But go
Down
ahead.
the
I'm
hall.
interested to
Is
hear
that
what you have to
is that
say.
even allowed?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to leave the love of my life dangling here.
I love your trumpets, man. That is so cool.
Oh yeah, it's a display that my oldest son suggested I put my collection up.
I was a drummer for quite a few years, so I appreciate the trumpet. Thank you.
Yeah, I remember my high school band director. It was not an Adventist school. High school band director had a sign on his office that said, "The end of the world has been postponed due to a lack of trained trumpeters." So, yeah, no. In response to my wife's request, I am living in the United States of America, not another country, and we are concerned with this Christian nationalism question. But Lauren reminded me of the differences back when we were very young, when there was an enforcement of this, the separation of church and state. I think, and I was in an elementary school, public elementary school. We had what they called release time Christian education. They couldn't do it in the classroom, so they pulled a big trailer up to the curb in front of the school, and the kids who wanted to, or their family agreed, could go take one period and do Christian songs and studies in the trailer outside the school. It was actually a very good program. I enjoyed it a lot. It was a good break from the normal routine. But that was a memory I had forgotten. Greg, thank you very much for quite an extensive presentation on the origin of the separation of church and state and the Establishment Clause. I think most folks who identify as Christian nationalists do not know those things very well or to any great extent. But I think I think that's not as important to them. I think they'll throw out the fact that we've always been a Christian nation. We founded as a Christian nation. Then they move on to where they want to go currently. And I'm more interested in where they want to go currently and what's happening with that than the origin of it, which is good to know, and what others think about it. Personally, look back at the history of Christianity. There's been a lot of movements and phenomena that were deemed very dangerous. We had the Crusades, you had the Inquisition, over and over, things pressing religion forward that ultimately disappeared. I personally think that the Christian nationalist movement will fade as we go forward and will not be a major problem. It could create some short-term problems for us. I sense that most of the people on this forum are not in favor of what we think of as Christian nationalism. But it's a question about where it's going now, how much damage or benefit it can be as we stand now. What's your view of the status of the folks? And by the way, many of them will not use that term, it turns out, as Christian nationalism. Very few actually identify themselves by that term. Is it true that that's a label that we're applying to them that they don't necessarily use? What's your view of what they do believe now, and where do you think it's going ahead of?
Okay. Yeah. Very good question. It's only about 17% of the 30% that are on the evangelical right that really make up the Republican Party right now. 17% are pretty rabid Christian nationalists. So it's a smaller percentage than most people realize. It's a very powerful percentage only in the sense that right now they have all levers of government, at least at the federal level temporarily. I tend to agree with you, though. I'm an optimist. I don't believe right now Christian nationalism is very unpopular right now. I would agree with you. I see a turn back. I always look back at Revelation 7, the four angels holding back the four winds of strife. I think I just from a and Lauren, I was a pastor for 10 years too, and also did evangelism in New York and Connecticut with Pastor Tony Moore, who you may know. Um, but I was his chief Bible worker. We raised a church together, and that was parts of 3 years that were some of my most formative, wonderful years. Tony Moore and Helen were such a great help to me. I applaud them. But no, I tend to be an optimist. I tend to think that in terms of the future, I'm not as paranoid as some. I tend to think that when you juxtaposition this call for annihilation of Iran by our current president. And then you have Pope, Leo the 14th calling for world peace and calm. In the end, that call for world peace, I know I sound like probably a Pollyanna, but I'm telling you, I think world peace wins the day in terms of people getting tired of these fundamentalist demands in our government and these nutcases rounding people up through ICE and so on, and caging children and separating them from their mothers, et cetera. I really believe this nation wants even my fellow Republicans are starting to wake up, and they're starting to smell the roses with gas prices and everything else. Because when they get hit economically hard, everybody seems to wake up for some reason. I've always said it's always about economics. James Carville, of course, agrees with me, or should I say I agree with him. I love James Carville, by the way. But anyway, so he's a character, man. Raging Cajun, I love that guy. Anyway, he speaks it plain, and boy, talk about speaking truth to power. But no, I think there's still hope for this country. But I also think I have another lecture called "The World Peace Threat to Religious Freedom," which is again, I tell everybody I'm an equal opportunity offender, so I I see both sides of the pendulum, if you will, and I think in the end, the the left gets so fed up with the right that we have that mainstream Christianity becomes more powerful at some point. Right now, they seem to be somewhat weak. But having been very active on the Interfaith Council of Greater Portland and also Seattle in my tenure at the North Pacific Union Conference, that's how I got all these leaders in Oregon to buy into an Oregon Workplace Religious Freedom Act. Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Jews, you name it. Wonderful people, and I love them to this day. I have loads of them on my as Facebook friends. And I really believe we're going to see more of an interfaith movement that really starts to, and it's growing. It's growing stronger and stronger, and it's a good thing. But I think in the end, they find common cause. And in my lecture, I show how they find common cause, like the Pharisees and Sadducees finally find common cause to crucify Christ. It's a fascinating lecture. If you ever want me to give that, Lauren, I'm happy to do
Okay.
that.
I've got a I've got a quick question to interject here for Dan. You've been open, you and Jeannie have been open here about having a trans son. Um, how does, and I'm sure that this is something that has worried you very much because there's just this Christian influence between Christianity and government that is just hateful
Right.
toward trans people. Dan, how are you and Gina? Do you think can cope with this and worry about this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Gina more than I, because she's a warrior anyway, but we're grateful that our son, Jack, who was Vanessa when born, um, is in an area of the country, Northern California, in a time of the country when a trans person is more accepted than in the past. And it's still a problem. It's still dangerous. It's still cause for worry. But it's better. This is a better situation than probably it's ever been for Jack and for us. But no, we're absolutely worried about it. And Jack would say, is this a choice? No, why would I possibly choose this kind of path? It's who the person is. We're happy to accept it. But you're right. It's a definite source of concern. Um, there's a celebration every year from trans people where they get together and they start reading off the names of trans people who have been killed during the year. And they go on and on. It's just heartbreaking. A lot of them are from out of this country, and there's many in countries that won't recognize who these people are and that their crimes have been committed against them. But yeah, it's a sign of our times. I'm hoping that it's a sort of a death throes of discrimination against all kinds of people with different on the spectrum of sexual orientation, and that we'll be at a better world going forward. That's my hope.
Thanks,
I'll
Dan.
just, I'll just say my son tells me that he won't listen to the news right now, so he's on hold. As are we. We don't listen to the news. It's just too discouraging. We see it now and then, but it's just listening to it every night is too depressing. So on that note, I'm going to Ray. Bring us some goodness and light here, Ray.
Sorry. Regarding the separation of church and state, Christian nationalism, while we say as a church we're for separation, I find it kind of ironical that I was raised anyway with the belief system and being taught that the USA is the place that God's watching over. It's the lamb that's going to be persecuted by whomever. And so today we have probably a very small percentage of Adventists who, according to your definition, would be leaning towards Christian nationalism. And I think it's easy to go that direction based upon our historical teachings.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we want the separation, but it seems to me we only want the separation to a certain degree,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's not a total separation of church and state, because
Mm-hmm.
we do want the monies. And I know there's that exception and all the rest of that stuff. But to
Mm-hmm.
me, when it comes to church money, I mean, not church monies, but government monies being used for schools and
Mm-hmm.
educations to be a pastor or whatever, we're really quibbling with words about separation of church and state. What is your views on that idea?
Well, no, you're dealing with a principle, and the principle is enshrined in law. Um, so I understand where I think I understand where you're coming from. As a legal scholar, I deal with trends and what do you call it in legal understanding, precedent and legal precedent and so forth. So I track that quite closely. Probably not as much as my other legal scholar friends who are heads and shoulders above me. I'm more of a historian and a pastor, a constitutional historian and a pastor. So I look at it from a historical perspective and a theological perspective, even prophetic. But um, I would disagree with you. It's not just words. Yes, we parse words. That's true. And I agree with you about the funding part. I think we're duplicitous there for sure. Um, so I wouldn't argue against that in terms of your um, analysis or your observations. So I'm not sure how to further answer your question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I tried.
I'm going to go to Ed Reifschneider. Ed, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. Very thorough coverage, Greg,
Thank you.
of the subject. Well, obviously, you've spent a lot of time researching and working on these issues. But I'm going to go a little counterculture.
Okay.
For the last few months, I've been pondering the fact that the Adventist agenda, if I can put it that way, is rooted in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, their issues are still our issues.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody printed somewhere recently, which I disagreed with, that we have antagonism toward Catholics, that there is a contentious relationship between our churches.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Catholics hardly know we exist.
Well, I'll counter that in a minute, but you finish.
That may be an
Well,
exaggeration. That may
no,
be
no,
an
no. I did
exaggeration.
studies on South and Central America, so it's different in different regions, but go ahead.
Yeah, I get that.
Mm-hmm.
So today, since the pioneers who lived during a time when there was great influxes of people from Ireland and Italy who are Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
had this as a fear.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some attempts at legislating Sunday laws in the mid to late 1800s. And so today we still carry that fear. We talk about it.
Sure.
And I'm frankly a little tired of our agenda in 2026 being set by people who lived in the mid 1800s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If Congress decides to pass a law and a president signs it that somehow limits religious freedom, we're not going to be able to do a darn thing about it.
Mm-hmm.
So what should our focus be today? If we're not focused on 19th century issues, should we be moving on to something else? What should our priorities and our focus be?
Well,
Or
is that
is my premise all wrong?
no, I think you have a rhetorical question, but I think it's also objective. It's a very rare uh, instance. Your question is a very rare instance of rhetorical question with objectivity. I like that. That's very you're pretty sharp. I like that. No, I commented. I don't know if it was on Evidence Today, Lauren, or if it was Evidence Review. I forget who posted it. It was about a competition in sports. We have this obsession. We pull out a quote by Ellen White and say, "Oh, we should have no competitiveness in sports, and sports is evil, and all this kind of stuff." And I'm going, "What? We use the God card for everything, don't we? I mean, it's like how crazy are we? I mean, it's like, you learn administrative leadership in sports. You learn team cooperation, team spirit. Um, you learn how to strategize. It's very good. I was captain of my debate team at Portland State University years ago, and trust me, we didn't lose, by the way. But I really enjoyed that, and I'm very Irish. I grew up in an Irish Catholic neighborhood. All my friends to this day, they come visit us out here in Grand Junction. Um, we're best of friends, including somebody by the name of Kelly, who was one of two ecclesiastical attorneys that were top attorneys that answered directly to the Pope for ecclesiastical matters, to the Vatican and the Holy See, but mostly handling church issues. She still lives in the same house she grew up in, was birthed in Bakersfield, just two houses down from where I grew up. Wonderful person, never married as a nun, but as an attorney. And just, I grew up with the O'Donnells, the Shaughnessy's, the Adams, the Armisteds, the Penners. I mean, I could go on and on. St. Joseph's Catholic Church down the street. I mean, yeah, I swam with them. We did everything together. We had our birthday parties together. We ate together. We had block parties. We played football together, basketball, baseball, you name it. We did everything. We even tried out with the Cincinnati Reds together. Okay. So, I mean, we did everything together. So we were the only Adventists on the block, So, no, I understand that. I did some papers, one research paper mainly about South America, but I focused mostly on Chile. We're the largest, fastest growing Protestant denomination in Chile, and we're getting close to, threatening the demographic population of Chile to overrun even Catholicism. We're exploding in South America, um, and we're becoming more and more of a threat. Now, that said, I believe I'm not naive, but at the same time, I believe that this Pope, as well as Francis, was far more interfaith and pro-interfaith, and it has countered Benedict and some of the fundamentalist leanings of the Catholic Church, which they war against. I mean, Francis packed the College of the Cardinals with progressive-minded bishops, and so it would take years to overtake that. So it's we have to remember that in Revelation 13, and I'm just going to get theological here real quick. In Revelation 13, the image to the beast is the new power. The Rome, all the way through the second half of Revelation 13, is a secondary power. It is not the primary power. We have to
Right.
remember that. And so to pile onto the Catholic Church, I think, is misguided. So I would agree with you. Okay. But as Mark Knoll wrote in his book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, he wrote it when he was at Wheaton College, but he's now a professor at Notre Dame, which I mentioned in my lecture. But it was his most famous book that he put out there in the mid 80s. And he basically argues that the intellectuals are the Catholics and the Protestants are the bodies. The Protestants have basically become Catholic, is what he argues. That the rise of the Christian right in the United States seeking absolute political power is the equivalent is basically the new Rome, if you will. Revelation 13, the rise of the image of the beast, is the new Rome, if you will. The image of the beast, that's the new Rome. You can basically say new Rome, you see, instead of image to the beast, you say new Rome. So it's more of a modern construct that I'm giving you, a new construct that most Adventists don't even think of. They still think, how many evangelists come into our churches? Oh, the Pope this, the Pope that, and it's the beast, and they're going to come and get you. It's like kind of like people, oh, the Illuminati, the Trilateral Commission, the government's going to come and get you. It's like, oh, give me a break. The government's a big bad wolf. All right, whatever. I mean, give me a break. So I have the same sort of pessimistic view of all that. And I say, no, it's not about Rome. Rome is actually quite weak right now. They will come into play at some point, I think, prophetically, but not right now, and not for quite a while. They've got too many other things to deal with in their own midst, and too many problems to deal with. And so I don't think they're as powerful as people make them out to be. I like these new popes that call for world peace. I like these new popes. This pope has been great, in my opinion. I mean, who am I to judge whether a pope's going to be saved or lost? I mean, I'm not pro-pope. I'm not pro-Catholic Church in terms of their beliefs, not in any way, shape, or form. But I will tell you, if you go back to the first Christian church, we owe a lot to the Catholic Church in terms of our Trinitarian views and our understanding of the true nature of Christ, going back to the original Nicene councils. I think we have to be careful. We should, like Mark Finley wrote in his book, a little tiny book called Studying Together. I think we need to find commonality among all different religions, to be ecumenical, if you will, to be interfaith, and to find common ground as a means of understanding and growing. Doesn't mean we have to yield our faith. That's not the point. I learned that in the interfaith community in Portland. You dialogue together and you learn from each other. You do not have to compromise or yield your faith. But if it means that their faith can help enlighten you, and maybe our faith can enlighten them and present it in such a way that doesn't enrage them, then I think we've accomplished something really good. And I think that's what Jesus would have us do.
All right.
Thank you. I have a very quick follow-up question. Your professional context seems to be in the Pacific Northwest, but you live in Grand Junction.
Only, I've only been here
I
5
live-
years. That's a new culture.
Indeed. Yeah, I live on the other corner of the state in Fort Collins.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm going to apologize to George Sylvester because Lauren had cut it off at Bjorn before, but I'm going to ask Bjorn to be our last speaker. And I'd asked for some international input since this has been a very US dominated discussion point. So I'm counting on Bjorn, who's a Swede who lives in England, to bring us that international perspective. Bjorn.
A Swede.
Yeah. Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Greg. Great discussion and presentation preceding that. Yeah, this is fascinating. So yes, I am Swedish, but live in the UK and in England specifically. And in Sweden, the Church of Sweden was the Lutheran Church was disestablished as a state church.
Stockholm's a beautiful city.
Thanks, and deeply secular as well. And in England, you still have the Church of England, but the thing is, nobody's that worried about this. Like even Adventists are not wringing their hands about the fact that there is a closer proximity between church and state in these countries because the population is so secular. So I think I don't know, it's a little bit harder for Adventists in this part of the world to understand the angst. And the angst seems to be specifically on the U.S. And the separation of church and state there. Like it's a big problem there, but not so much anywhere else, which I've found confusing. My question though is, and I don't mean this to sound anti-American. However, America has rarely been weaker than it is currently.
Sure.
And it's been declining in power steadily for decades. You have an ascending China, and I mean, not even Iran seems to be that worried about the U.S. currently.
Right.
I want to be a strong Adventist, but how worried are we really about the separation of church and state and a declining power? And I'm interested in Ed's perspective as well. Like, are we clinging to sort of 19th century concerns and interpretations and this need for America to be top dog? Like, does America need to be top dog for Adventists to be right, or for the Bible to be true? It just seems like we're kind of losing the frame here and perhaps concerned about the wrong things.
No, I concur with you. I have no argument there. I see exactly what you see. And if you heard my talk on the world peace threat to religious freedom, it's an international situation that is more interesting to me. Like I said, I helped. I spoke in 28 Romanian cities before all the leaders, including Parliament. I've met with the Iran's vice president in South Africa. I've done all kinds of different things. but that was years ago. And I'm telling you that, yeah, the world's much more complicated than we in the U.S. really realize, and we do have more of this. What do you call it? This myopic focus, and it is a problem. And it was pointed out to me in all my international diplomatic journeys that General Conference sponsored me to go on. So I mean, yeah, as a diplomat working with Dr. Burt Beach and others, Nelu Burcha, who's now our world public affairs and religious liberty leader, who's one of my closest friends. Um,
Cool.
and yeah, I helped him get his United Nations job and now his world leadership job. I'm probably his closest friend. Um, and I don't say that lightly. I'm not name dropping. It's true. You could ask him yourself. Anyway, we've done a lot together. Um, but yeah, no, I get what you're saying, and I think one of the issues that I keep harping on is this false piety and the doctrine of prophetic inevitability. It's this American exceptionalism, this idea that because America must triumph, therefore, let's get on the bandwagon of Christian nationalism. And by the way, we're hastening the coming of Christ. By the way, that's Ben Carson's philosophy through and through. I've interviewed him formally 4 times, and I'm telling you, there's a real problem there. He was raised on John Birch Society literature. If you know anything about John Birch Society here in the United States, John Birch Society was basically put together by Mormons and Baptists. And they saw communism and everything. It was basically an organization that arose during the Cold War period. And they see communists and socialists and everything. And they're very much almost, even though they disavow it, almost aligned with the thinking of the Ku Klux Klan. It's very white supremacist in their thinking. And yeah, we as Adventists with our prophetic mindset see everything in apocalyptic terms. And it really, and they think they have all knowledge with that. And yet, as someone who's an interdisciplinary scholar who have delved into all kinds of areas, being a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, have been for 38 years, member of the Supreme Court Historical Society, you begin over time to see the world completely differently. And I think many of our ministers and evangelists don't look at things in an interdisciplinary academic way. And because they don't, it's so simplistic that it's so easy for our Adventists to hold on to all kinds of wild-eyed conspiracy theories. And that just drives me nuts. And how do I get through to them? I just try to love them and befriend them. And hopefully over time, I can teach them. But it's slow. And that's all I can do, one person at a time. And if you really look at Jesus' ministry, his most effective ministry was the one person at a time ministry.
Just
Thanks
based
for the
on,
response.
thanks, Bjorn. Just based on trying to get prepared for this little presentation today about Christian nationalism, I thought it would be interesting to see what the progress or percentage of Christians over time was in the United States. And I thought it was interesting that in the early 1970s, it was a 90% people professed to be Christians. And there were about 5% that were declared to be other religion. And over time, as it progressed, the other religions stayed at 5 to 7%, whereas the Christians actually declined to about 63% by 2017 or 18, which is the last year they surveyed it. But it was the nuns, it was the group of nuns stating no religion who had dramatically increased to nearly 30% over that same time period. So if we're concerned about Islamophobia or singling out being anti-Semitic, these are not the people that are threatening us. It's people who are leaving the Christian faith to become non-Christians or non-believers. And I think it makes all of us need to think between maybe now and over the next week, what is the Christian religion doing that's driving people away? Because that's really the problem.
Well, it's funny you should mention that because actually the vast majority, as pointed out by Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry in their 2 books, they're both sociologists, and they point out the one in the flag and the cross, especially in their diagrams and their surveys and their so on, they point out that the vast majority of Christian nationalists have been the unchurched all along. Many of them are, gun-toting patriots, and then they just put a cross around their neck or pretend to be Christians and take on the symbolism of Christianity, which I found fascinating in their surveys and their studies. It's a deep dive. You should look at their books. It's quite fascinating.
I'm going to give it to Lauren to wrap it up, but I appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts with us. This is a
Thank you.
topic that we discuss at home. I think it's very interesting. Lauren, have you got some closing comments for us?
Can I say something about your son? Can I just make a little comment? I think everybody's on a journey. And I think when we're born, we don't profess anything. We're all children of God. Jesus looks at us from the time we're born. And we're people created by God in the image of God. Doesn't matter whether later we profess to be Islam or born into it or whatever. Adventist, Catholic, Mormon, doesn't matter. The bottom line is Jesus doesn't look at us that way. Jesus doesn't look at a person as gay. Jesus doesn't look at a person as trans. He looks at you as a child in the image of God, period. And I really believe that Jesus would have us treat everyone equally, except there's one exception: brutal genocide murderers.
Well, I appreciate that. And I just have to say that the decision we made was just to love our child. Because that's really what he needs. And
Amen.
it's interesting that there are so many people in the LGBTQ community who are very anti-Christian because of the stance the Adventist Church and other Christian churches have taken against that community. And we actually feel that our son has been kind of an ambassador for helping people understand that there are kind and nice Christians, because he's had a very good friend group that he went to Adventist college with who's absolutely stood by him. So it's just interesting. It's been an interesting journey for sure, but I appreciate your comments.
The Good Samaritan didn't ask the guy on the side of the road what religion he was or
Well, exactly.
what exactly he was. No, Good Samaritan to me is the greatest person in the Bible outside of Jesus Christ and perhaps Moses. But I'm telling you that Good Samaritan is like the lodestar for me.
You have to wonder about the theology of the Adventist Church and why they think it's been important to take positions on the LGBTQ community, that they adopt, different policies and statements. It was never there before, but for some reason they feel called to put it out there, and it's enough of a reason for me to step away from it. But anyway, that's a topic for another day.